Astro's Playroom is one of the most interesting games to come out last year, and here are 3 reasons why. First, it came free with a console, a concept we used to take for granted back in the old days, but seems rarer and rarer as time moves on. So, how do you design a game that plays well for everybody, even people who didn't realize they were getting it? Secondly, it's an interactive 3D museum piece, a game where you travel from level to level, collecting PlayStation artifacts like old consoles, controllers, multi-taps, and modems. And thirdly, the whole reason this game exists is that Sony wanted to show developers how best to use their PlayStation 5's new DualSense controller. Astro's Playroom, like Team Asobi's previous games, was born from internal tech demos that were created to demonstrate how designers could leverage Sony's new technology. There's a lot going on here behind the scenes, so to get to the bottom of it all, we talked to the game's director, Nicolas Doucet, to find out how this whole project came about, where exactly they drew the line when it came to in-game collectibles, and the ways in which they imagine developers might use the DualSense controller in the future. Oh, and this video is the first of ours to be produced entirely in 4K, so if your internet pipe is wide enough, use the gear button to select 4K playback.
My name is Nicolas Doucet, and I'm the creative director on Astro's Playroom. I came over to Japan in 2011, and before that I was working in a London studio. When I came over, actually, it was a time where the PS4 was being researched. It was in the making. I came as a producer, and at the time there was this new controller and a camera on PlayStation 4. And that it did need a little bit of some research. And because I had experience working on the iToy for the PS2 and later the PlayStation Eye for PS3, it kind of made sense to try and put a small team together and try and see where we would end up going. In the end, it ended up being Team Asobi, which is a game developer today. But in fact, at the beginning, it was meant to be some R&D, just a small group doing research and just presenting other developers with possibilities. And that was the idea, to create a kind of bridge between development hardware, R&D, and game teams. But it turned out that every time you do this kind of research, you cannot resist the temptation to make your own game. And that's how we end up in this cycle where we go through R&D and then we make a game. And then we go through R&D and then we make a game. As we were working through Astro Bot Rescue Mission for PSVR, that's what the main team was doing. And we put together a small team on the side. It was only 3-4 people. Mostly programmers, engineers, who would get some prototypes of the DualSense controller from the hardware division. I think we were one of the first teams to really get like a working version of it. We knew the hardware division, they're not putting games together, they don't really turn their technology into applications. However, they get a hunch for what technology might be the technology of the future, and they try many things. Certain things then get refocused or kind of dropped because of various reasons. But actually, they have a good kind of feeling of what might be exciting to game developers. So they give us this prototype, and it looks nothing like the final controller. It looks like it's usually built on the previous controller. Plus, it's got some extension, it's got cables, it's got like boards sticking out. So it's like you have it in your hand, and it's that big, right? And it's But it has, for example, the haptic feedback was in there, the adaptive triggers were in there. So very quickly we could start putting together some quick demos. And when I say quick demos, it's really like, the graphics don't matter, but it has something that makes you feel, oh, I've never felt this before, and I've never had this kind of gameplay experience before.
Over the course of 9 months to a year, Team Asobi worked with the hardware team to develop 80 gameplay demos, each of these demos made to show off a potential use of the DualSense controller. Some were as simple as surface tests, which demonstrated the different haptic feedback you might feel on concrete, ice, or sand. Others were gameplay ideas like shooting galleries or platformers. The point of these was to demonstrate to internal and external studios how they might use the DualSense's new tech to improve their games. And while some of these have made their way into early PlayStation 5 games, there are others we may see from studios further down the road.
In the very early days, they were shared within the PlayStation studios. And I remember that was really, in fact, some of the demos we picked. In Astro's Playroom, there's a climbing game, where you get inside a monkey suit and you're climbing. In fact, that very first tech demo, we were not thinking of making our own climbing game, but we thought, okay, in this day and age, climbing in video games is a classic mechanic now. Uncharted and Assassin's Creed and all these games use it. And so we thought, okay, having using the adaptive triggers to simulate this kind of like grabbing and kind of like climbing grabbing ledges and stuff would be something that people would be interested in. So that was a motivation for going there. Another example is we didn't use it in Astro's Playroom, but we had a whole collection of like ball bouncing games. So you could use the adaptive trigger and just bounce, like from a ping pong ball, tennis ball, volleyball, basketball, soccer ball, and all that. And again, we did that because we thought, well, at some point, these demos are gonna get in the hands of people who do like, sports simulations, and they need to be inspired.
Over the course of this development, there was a constant back and forth between Team Asobi and the hardware division. Feedback went in both directions as they tweaked how the controller responded to the player's actions. Much like their previous projects, once development had come to an end, they were left with a handful of gameplay demos. So when the thought came as to how to put these in a game, the obvious choice was a selection of minigames. But given the successful reception to Astrobot's Rescue for PlayStation VR, the team wanted to take another swing at making a platformer. That at least explains how Astro's Playroom came to be, but it doesn't quite explain how the game became a celebration of PlayStation's history. In an industry which is so often preoccupied with looking forward, how did the folks at Team Asobi convince Sony to look backwards? And how did they convince dozens of studios to let their IP jump on board?
In Astrobot Rescue Mission for VR, the first boss is a gorilla boss on top of a building. And in fact, the top of the building is a PlayStation. But it's huge. So when you look to your side, you can see the power button, the reset button. This kind of like Easter eggs thing, I think we've been wanting to do that from forever. More than that, I think it's a bit of a fan service. Even, it makes us happy because, we're really proud to be, part of this family. When Astro's Playroom came to be made with all these tech demos, because it's a platformer, it needed collectibles and things to serve the tempo of the game. That's when these two ideas came up. First of all, something rich, something that that can really mark the end of a level that you can really get and be really proud to have collected. And so the consoles was the first thing. We had this idea of theming each one of the worlds to the actual console. But rather than doing that, we themed them to the component parts of the PS5. And there's no real rule, like there may be a mixture of like, you might find some PS1, 2, or 3, or 4 references inside one world. But at the end, you do get this kind of big artifact, which is, one of the symbolic consoles. And once we've done that, then it feels like, well, let's go further. So we did the first test, in fact. We modeled the PS1, and the first one, we did it by brute force. We literally modeled it, just looking at the console, and we had this amazing modeler. And we put that in front of the person responsible for the hardware, the gatekeeper for hardware things at PlayStation. And he loved it. And he's from those days, he's seen the PS1 in the making. So I think, he was really happy with the quality. So then that gave us a benchmark. When you get to this final section and there's a big cable and all these bots, they're trying to pull it, but they can't. And you have to give it a final tug and you get this kind of big console. So either the PS1, 2, 3, or 4. I think he came from the very strong desire to have that PS1 boot in the game. It's such an iconic one. It's one that I think a lot of people would agree. It gives you the chills, When you hear that thing, it's just special, right? First, you get this kind of like bassy sound, which is slightly intimidating. And then the PlayStation logo appears and you have this sort of like fizz, like this twinkle thing. That's supposed to actually calm you and almost like give you the opposite feeling. And that's incredible that that these guys were thinking about this way to kind of get the gamers inside the mindset of emotional mindset, right? And then we thought, well, now we have the PS1 one. PS2 would work, PS3 had that kind of like violin, and then PS4 was kind of also had the background music.
For the most recent hardware, the team had access to industrial data, but the older stuff required new 3D scans, especially some of the more esoteric pieces. And I think this is where a lot of the love for Astro's Playroom comes from. Yes, each of the game's 4 zones rewards you with a console from Sony's past, but each of these levels are also littered with other hardware collectibles which range from the memorable to the not so memorable. So how exactly did they figure out where to draw the line?
The hardest part was actually to decide the cutoff line, where do we go and where do we not go? So we decided, for example, to not include like TV tuners and stuff like that because, we just needed a rule, and we thought, okay, we're just going to keep it to games, and games only. The more strange ones, I think, the network adapter is one of them. The hard drive. So we had a hard drive and network adapter separate, but then it became interesting. According to regions, they're all different. So you had network adapters, some of them were 56K, some of them were broadband. We can't have them all because it's already minor enough as it is, So I think we went for the one that combined, like several features in one, and we dropped the rest. Some generations have more accessories than others. So when you're trying to kind of balance it and spread it across the game, in a balanced way, it turns out that, you have to make this kind of adjustments. So, for example, back then there used to be like, memory cards, multi-taps. But now we have, more perhaps like a slim console. There were 2 slim consoles on the PS3 era. So we had to kind of balance it out so that, all sets were, equal. Yeah. And the other thing is like, if you're going to give people a PS1 to look at, there is an eject button and people want to push that button. They want to press the power button and they want to hear the audio and they want to see the flip, the lid flipping. It would be unthinkable to just make them as like a static, thing. So I think it's serving the game as a whole just for the fun, but it's also like being authentic to what I think people expected. I hope people felt like we, hit all the buttons and we didn't forget anything. Video games have this amazing privilege is that they are interactive. So there's no reason why everything in the world should react to your actions. And so that's something that's a kind of philosophy that we brought together from previous games, especially from Astro in VR, where you're trying to make people believe that they are in this world. So everything should react. There should be nothing that is just static or just not moving. We've always said that the team philosophy would be that to make toys as well as video games. The making of these character cameos was also quite interesting because we know we're going to be doing 4 areas. We know we're going to have the hardware, but then you ask yourself, okay, but what is PlayStation without the games, right? So we need to go out and we need to start putting games in. We start with the ones that are easiest for us to kind of, we're confident about. So the ones that were made in Japan. And then next, it's about going out to these other PlayStation studios. We have a great relationship with them. So, we can go to a few. And I think Kratos was the one that we did first. There was a lot of props, there's the boat, there's, Kratos, Atreus and stuff. So, and that's when, we had the PlayStation studio covered. And I think at that point, there's about probably like 50. It's not everything, but it's a selection. Again, you have to cut the line somewhere. There are some series which you could not be talking of PlayStation without. I mean, Ridge Racer, Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, Final Fantasy, Tomb Raider. It's these ones, they're too iconic, Crash Bandicoot. And honestly, at that point, I was thinking, I don't have the confidence that we can get approval because it sounds like a mountain to climb. It sounds like everybody's going to have a different kind of viewpoint. Everybody's going to want something. There's going to be the whole kind of like, are we going to have to maybe like do something special in return? But then we just went for it. We approached, I think, 12 of them. Yeah. And amazingly, everybody, so they looked at the God of War one. That was a reference. And they say, okay, you're going to have the same treatment. We're in. Like I'm really glad we could put a TRX in there. For a long time, the TRX was a question mark. Are we gonna put a final boss or like? But the TRX was just like too good. This thing is very meaningful to those people who were there, and I think it's very rare. It's too rare. I mean, an opportunity like that comes once in a blue moon, right? Maybe we'll never get one again. So to be able to celebrate, really write the best possible love letter we could. I think it's too special, too much, privilege. I would say that's probably the part that I'm most proud of. It's really interesting to dive into these old tech demos, and actually the whole history of this T-Rex demo is really fascinating too. It's really the turning point where I think PlayStation rallied support to this amazing kind of technological wow that was PlayStation 1, and that demo was an important part of that.
The team split the game into 4 zones. Each of these would end with a collectible of one of the 4 legacy consoles, and each of these would have levels that demonstrated a different facet of the new controller: ball rolling, climbing, springing, and the jetpack. Team Asobi believed that these were some of the strongest mini-games they made that could stand on their own. but still sprinkled in some of the other tech demos throughout the levels. But there is still one major obstacle to overcome. Astro's Playroom was to be a pack-in game pre-installed on every PlayStation 5. So did that ever impact the design of the game? And how do you create a platformer that's meant to appeal to everyone, regardless of their age or gameplay experience?
This game, we proposed to do this when we had all these tech demos. We didn't have to make. No one forced us to make it, but I think we went back to the same old guys that we made the Playroom and Playroom VR with. There were the few things to hit, but the most important was a magical introduction to DualSense controller. That was always the main piece. People need to leave this game, whatever it is, with this feeling that, this is special. There is nothing, I think, more satisfying than to feel like you're getting this kind of amazing new cutting edge piece of hardware, but on top of that he has, he does things that you want to show to your friends. I think that's probably like the most important thing we wanted to do. And then for us, there was also this idea that it's a way to experiment making games outside of VR, and to see whether Astro can stand on his own feet to carry an entire game. So there was a bit of a personal goal for us too. And so I'm really glad that we were able to combine both of them, because it could have just been, once again, it could have been a collection of mini games. But he was more than that. It was the DualSense showcase plus, platformer. So I think we were able to do that. That's probably like the biggest takeaway, I think. The game has this kind of like simple jumping and punching, and we kept it simple exactly for the reasons you mentioned. Is that we don't think like, a level of complexity should be reached through the layering of simple things, not by just making complicated things. When you show the controls, you don't want to have a controller with like lots of lines coming out and this button does this and this does that. I mean, some people can take that, but I think our audience being so wide, we're trying to touch everybody who's going to be buying a PlayStation 5, and that means we made a decision to include like almost like two layers of play. So the first layer is you can run around and you can jump and punch. And then there's this layer of like time attack, So the time attack, we've put that in exactly for this layer of like extra players who are really gonna get down to the nitty-gritties and really kind of compete. To be honest, we never expected it's gonna be that popular. It's hard, I watch a lot of HGDQ, or some games on Quick, and I'm always amazed about these old games that passed the test of times, where today people play them to try and shave like a few seconds, a few minutes, and you see the communities, and it's really amazing. I'm not sure we're anywhere near, when I say that kind of finesse, but for some people it offered enough for them to go back and try and find new ways of doing things. So it was our first time getting into this. It's quite scary because you're really getting into this pro territory, but it's interesting to stretch or gameplay so that actually he can cater for like you said, a small child, but also still be interesting for somebody who is really trying to get like best score. So I think what's important for us is to never sacrifice this game for everybody philosophy. I think it's quite a small team, all things considered, and I think this game is a testament of like everybody really taking like almost like wearing several hats. Everybody is a game designer in the team, and I think that's really important when you make something like a platformer. We talked about earlier about how the world is interactive. Well, the world being interactive, a lot of the time it comes down to the animators or the artists. They decide to put a cactus in a game. If they punch the cactus wobbles in a funny way. That's not something that was designed. That is something that this modeler, this artist that put a cactus down, went the extra mile and making that extra fun. We don't just like segment into like the game designers decide the ideas and the others kind of implement them. There's a little bit more of a cross kind of pollination, and I think that one is a really important thing. The other thing I want to talk about is like the fact we're based in Japan, and there is something about character control and fine character control and this kind of like pixel perfect reaction, which is something that I find really runs in the blood, I think, of Japanese developers. It's something that is very hard to explain. It's very, very hard to put your finger on it, but I felt it several times working through this game and the previous game with the team, where there are moments where we're playing the game and something feels wrong or feels right, but you can't quite explain what it is. Perhaps the person who programmed has a better understanding of it, but in fact, it's very subjective. However, we can just look at each other and we know what we mean. Yeah, it feels wrong. There is something here that feels sticky. It doesn't feel like your jump is reactive. It's something a little bit hard to put in words. But I think it's probably something linked to the craft culture that Japan has got. And this is something that coming into this country, I really had a huge respect for, and I continue having it. I played a lot of these Japanese games over the last 30 years. Every game is different and every kind of character feels, different. But when you pick up a controller, especially a platformer where it's not so much about events that's going to happen here and there and in between, is you just walking around. Every step you take is the game, right? It's all about this kind of jump and where you're going to land in this kind of pixel perfect connection between these various kind of blocks that makes the game. In fact, more than the storytelling, that's the story, right? It's this kind of few seconds and this tempo and this melody. It becomes so important that every micro detail becomes important. And a platformer feeling good is actually a difficult thing to do, and I take no credit for that. This is the team and the people who work on character control and things like that. And being able to actually make this type of game, a platform game, in Japan with Japanese developers together, and having this sort of feeling that connection, I think it's again, it's a massive privilege. It's a bit of a kid's dream, being here with this bunch of women and men. So it's really cool. So musician Kenneth Young, he was on Astro Bot Rescue Mission before that, and so we've been talking about having a song for some time. In fact, there was one in Astro Bot Rescue Mission, but it was a very short lyrics. It was for the fire stage, and so he just went away, and he came back a few days later, and he sent me this song, and that had no robotic voices. That was his voice singing, which is very, and it's funny because he has this kind of Scottish accent. He's Scottish, but actually when he sings, it sounds like a completely different person. And he sends the text with it, and he had written everything. But he went on looking around, making sure that the adjectives he was using about tessellation and all that rendering stuff, that he wasn't actually writing anything that was wrong. It's a love song, and it's a love song about kind of fooling someone, or kind of how love can be a little bit it looks that way, but in fact, he feels this way because you're not paying attention to all the things I'm doing in the background. That's the kind of his analogy, and that's really smart because it's actually what a lot of the visual arts and visual art, the magic of getting rendering technologies. Actually, it looks a certain way, but in the background there's lots of tricks going on. You do your streaming. When you're looking over there, the stuff behind you has disappeared. When you turn around, it's reappeared, and all that kind of stuff. He put that, and so it's as a song, it works on so many different layers. It's funny for kids because it's kind of this funny mountain kind of singing this funny song with monkey sounds. But then he has this sort of love story level, and then he has this sort of tech level, I suppose. Really smart. That's Kenny's genius.